I have the great pleasure of introducing three esteemed individuals from different areas that are actually the leading voices for the respective areas. So for anybody who doesn't know them, they have longer bios in the program. But Steve Cutler, of course, is the chairman for JP Morgan. He was previously general counsel there. He'd been a partner at Wilmer Hale and a director of the SEC's Division of Enforcement. Barney Frank spent 32 years serving in the House of Representatives, and of course is the Frank of the Dodd-Frank Act. So I think we'll have quite a bit to share with us over the congressional dynamics of financial regulation. And right here to my left, Jack Coffey is the Adolph Burley Professor of Law at Columbia Law School, as well as the director of the Center for Corporate Governance at the law school. He has been listed, I think, more times than I can count on the 100 most influential lawyers, and provides the academic perspective here. So we have industry, government, academia, and an incredibly rich conversation that is going to be focused not on the quantity of regulation, which I think too often dominates the headlines, but the deeper question of how we go about structuring the nature of regulation to be responsive to the problems that we're seeking to address, where we are right now, and what's going to happen in the coming years. So do you want to start us off, Steve?
Sure. First of all, I should say it's really an honor to be up here with these two gentlemen. The gentleman immediately to my right changed my life over the last decade. And the gentleman two over, I would say, he doesn't know this, but when I was at the SEC, I always used to read what Professor Coffey would say, and I'd say to myself, that's incredibly annoying, and you know he's right. I am delighted to be here with you today and here with these two gentlemen in particular. So I thought I would actually, let's see, I think the way I want to talk about this is to talk about four cautionary items in regulation. And this feels a little presumptuous, and I probably should let these gentlemen do it, but I'm going to take a crack at it. And they're idiosyncratic, so you know we could choose lots of ways to talk about regulation, but these are on the forefront of my mind, particularly as we sit here today. First, beware of extremes. Sort of regulation goes through boom and bust cycles just the way economies do. It was only, I'd say, a dozen years ago that we were talking about in this country in a very serious way. Some people may remember that Eliot Spitzer convened a commission to think about principles-based versus rules-based regulation. What was that about? That was about competing with the UK for listings. As the UK was thinking about how to regulate in a kinder, gentler way, we were too. Once you're in that place, think about whether you've gone, whether the pendulum has swung too far. I would say in the same way, you can think about some of what's happened over the last several years at the other end of the pendulum. And maybe best reflective of this is what the government said in connection with the United States GSIB surcharge rule. This is the rule that applies additional capital charges to the biggest financial institutions. So what the government said is cost-benefit analysis was not chosen as the primary calibration framework for the GSIB surcharge. It is not directly related to the mandate provided by the Dodd-Frank Act, which instructs the board, that's the Federal Reserve Board, to mitigate risks to the financial stability of the United States. I think once you start talking about regulation, divorced from costs, divorced from, I think, the objective, remember, regulation has dual objectives, especially in this space. One is financial stability, but on the other side is growth and economic inclusion. And I think once you ignore one of those, you may have gone too far on the other side of the pendulum. Finally, I would say today, sitting where we are, I wouldn't let calls for regulatory reform become calls for wholesale deregulation. A lot of what's happened over the last decade has been so important. Capital buffers, recovery and resolution planning, stress tests, the creation of a regulator whose mission is the protection of consumers. All those are really good things, and we ought not, as we think about recalibrating, throwing out those babies with the bathwater. Second, regulators have to step back and look at the whole of what they're doing. They can't get siloed even within their own agencies, and they have to think about the full landscape of what they're doing. And I think about something like liquidity regulation and what's happened in that area over the last decade. And mind you, liquidity regulation has been incredibly important to achieving financial stability in the system. But we now have the liquidity coverage ratio. We have the net stable funding ratio. We've got the short-term wholesale factor in the GSIB surcharge. We've got it within the total loss absorbing capacity regulations requirements around long-term funding and limitations on short-term funding. We've got CLAR, which is the Comprehensive Liquidity Assessment and Review process. We've got stress testing, which is contemplating the addition of liquidity shocks. All of those may make sense individually, but if they're not accounting for the other, if they're not assuming compliance with the other, I think there's a danger of over-regulation. Third, I would say beware of multi-regulator overlap and duplication. We've seen this in the Volcker rule, we've seen this in the mortgage area, we've seen this in recovery and resolution where more than one regulator is at that table. And that can create, I think, some very, very difficult situations both for financial institutions and ultimately for the public in how regulations are both created and enforced. And then I would say that the multi-regulator problem, and let me just give you one example of that. In Volcker itself, we've got 5 different regulators who've had to agree on what Volcker means, how it should be enforced, how it should be interpreted. In the mortgage area, second example, we're subject to, at JP Morgan, I think 7 different federal regulators and a panoply of state regulations every time we issue and we service mortgages. Recovery and resolution, the last one I mentioned, you've got not only the Fed, but you've got the FDIC involved. And I don't think that's a recipe for good regulation. So echoing this in the enforcement side, we've got, and we've seen a proliferation over the last decade of multi-regulator actions every time someone does something wrong. And I don't think that's particularly healthy either. You know, when you've got, so I'll give a JP Morgan example, our London whale situation. We were dealing with 5 and 6 different regulatory enforcement arms, each one of whom decided on a monetary sanction without regard to what the others were doing. That's not good regulation, that's not good enforcement. Finally, and my fourth idiosyncratic point is that enforcement can both complement and alternatively it can negatively undermine regulatory policy. So 2 examples here. One, FHA and the use of the False Claims Act. So lots of financial institutions paid, massive penalties in connection with the FHA lending that they did, in connection with what I would tell you were non-scienter based, sort of not intentional mistakes in connection with mortgage lending, that over the course of time, the FHA and financial institutions had developed a course of conduct on that was completely ignored once a U.S. Attorney's Office decided that they were going to bring False Claims Act cases. What's that done? That's essentially taken big financial institutions, way down in FHA lending. That's probably not a policy that the government wanted to achieve here. And so the way that the way the government went about enforcing the rules has very much affected policy. A second, I'll give you again a JP Morgan example. In connection with one of our settlements with the government, we were penalized for what happened at Bear Stearns. We were also required to give up an indemnity right in connection with our acquisition of the assets of WAMU. Those are things that the United States government wanted. Those are transactions that the United States government wanted. And yet, when it came time to enforcers deciding what the appropriate sanctions or penalties were, they dealt with those acquisitions in very different ways. And so when we complained to the Justice Department about a penalty related to Bear Stearns, the response we got and said, look, the United States asked us to take over Bear Stearns. Why would you want to penalize us for pre-acquisition conduct by Bear Stearns? And the response we got was, that was the Department of Treasury, we're the Department of Justice. How do you think the next time we have a crisis, a financial institution that's asked, hey, you should think about acquiring this company because it'll help the economy, it'll help prevent a crisis, how do you think that company is going to react? I'll turn it over to Congressman Frank.
I'll begin by saying that I said exactly that publicly with regard to Bear Stearns. In fact, you understated the case. You weren't asked to take over Bear Stearns. You were pressured by the Bush administration, specifically Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke, to take over Bear Stearns. And I was there. I was chairman of the committee. I understand that. And I thought it was exactly for the reasons you said, a terrible mistake. It was both unfair and counterproductive for the future. You can differentiate. The Bank of America faced the same situation with regard to being held accountable for the previous mistakes of Merrill Lynch and also of Countrywide. Now, Countrywide, they eagerly went out and sought, and they deserved everything they got for Countrywide. I was asked what I thought at the time about Bank of America taking over Countrywide, and I said, look, I'd be happy if Syria took over Countrywide. It was an outrageous, irresponsible institution. But in the Merrill case, that was very similar to the Bear case, and no, the federal government was wrong, and I was very disappointed that they did not intervene or object to that. On the other hand, I'm much less sympathetic to the complaint about the London whale because J.P. Morgan Chase brought that on itself, not simply in the mistakes, which will happen, but in the resistance to any regulation whatsoever. And if you take a position that there should be no regulation, that makes it harder to work with us to get the right kind of regulation. And the fact is that when the London whale hit, a bill was on its way through the Republican-controlled Congress with J.P. Morgan's great enthusiasm to say that the American regulators would have no jurisdiction whatsoever over the derivative activities of foreign subsidiaries of American banks. So the position that J.P. Morgan Chase had was that it should be none of America's business what happened with the London whale. Now, I will acknowledge that.
But by the way, Congressman, I don't think that was our position at all, but...
I was there.
Look,
Excuse me. I was on the committee. I didn't interrupt you, but you go ahead. Tell me what was your position with regard to... Let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
Was it not J.P. Morgan Chase's position that the American regulators should have no jurisdiction over the derivative activities of the subsidiaries in England on the basis that they were being regulated over there?
Well, let me put it this way.
Could you answer the question?
The regulations under which we were, on which enforcement actions were brought in the United States existed prior to Dodd-Frank and we're completely fine with. And by the way, we acknowledge that we made serious
You haven't answered my
mistakes.
question. You were pushing a bill. I'm sorry, this is my time. You were pushing a bill.
All right,
It went
you-
through the committee. The bill went through the committee. You guys were for it, which would have said that the CFTC and the SEC had no jurisdiction over the activities of the London-based subsidiary. So whatever regulations had been there, they would have gone because you would have been free of any regulation. And that's what happens. And by the way, it's the same with mortgages. The fact is that up until the crash, the financial industry as a whole resisted any regulation. And it would have been better if we could have been able to work together on some of them. And by the way, the frustration originally came from Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke. Much of the structure of the bill really came out of their notions of what to do. So, and that was particularly the case in mortgages. There was great resistance. I don't hold you guys all accountable for this, but in November 6, 2007, it's our first year back in power, when we were putting a bill through for the first time to restrict subprime mortgages being given to people who were unlikely to pay them back. I was attacked in an editorial which said I was keeping low-income minority owners from being homeowners. It was in the Wall Street Journal. They said we were creating a Starbucks for housing. And interestingly, they boasted, celebrated the fact that about 80% of the loans are being repaid on time, not previously, in my judgment, a great statistic about the reliability of loans. So I agree, there were problems worked out. The second thing I would agree on is the proliferation of regulatory activities. It's a political problem, two problems that people wonder why we haven't simplified. The stupidest public policy in America in this area is to have a separate Securities and Exchange Commission and Commodity Futures Trading Commission. It is a total mess, and you can't figure out who did what, and we tried hard to separate them out.
And it's Congress's fault.
Well, who do you think I'm blaming? Oh, wow, what a brilliant point. What a brilliant point. I'm about to explain. Yeah, I'm about to explain why we have no, but by the way, it's not the Congress's fault alone. It's the American people's fault. And there is this great mistaken analysis that assumes that what goes on in Washington is a kind of a bubble. No, the public has a major impact. The two major duplications in our regulatory system come from political pressure. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission is seen by the agricultural interests as their baby. And the SEC, they see as the tool of the East Coast and West Coast, increasingly, interests. And there would simply have been no way to get a bill through and merge them. Now, I want to say this. We were trying to, you can only do so many things at once in a political context. Passing the substantive regulations in the face of a great deal of resistance from the financial community made it hard to rationalize the organizational structure as well. Going forward, I think there may be a chance to rationalize the organizational structure when that's the only thing that you are working on. I was aware of the problem. We were trying to sort out the jurisdiction. I proposed at one point that the CFTC be given jurisdiction over everything edible. That would be the best way to rationalize it, but there was just too much political resistance. The other one is, and this is something that people lose track of, we have, unlike, I believe, most other all other countries, certainly most, the dual banking system, state and federal chartered banks. Chris Dodd in particular wanted to put all bank regulation into the control of the currency, taking some of that away from the Fed, and the state chartered banks objected and said, no, you can't throw us in there with the big guys because it'll be one size fits all. So that's another reason, again, and it's the electorate that, yes, Congress made the final decision, but responding to electoral pressures. The other thing I did want to say with regard to the rollback, Mr. Winter was right. There is virtually no rollback coming legislatively, and I take that, frankly, as sort of vindication, as a sign that things are working reasonably well. There are tweaks that need to be done, but you will not see any significant legislative change in the bill that we adopted in 2010. The House did pass a bill that would have essentially abolished it. Nobody other than the people on that committee paid any attention to it. They kind of let them do that. That had the same impact as those repeated repeals of the health care bill back when they knew it was going to be vetoed. So the House passed that bill knowing that the Senate would not take it up. The Senate is totally ignoring it. What you have now going through the Senate is what alluded to, relaxing the rules for banks under $10 billion in assets. And one mistake we made, which was $50 billion was too low for people to be put into the FSOC. I thought it should be 100. They're talking about 250. 250 worries me a little bit because Lehman was 700 something, and you get to a couple of 250s and you can have some kind of problem. But those are the only substantive changes that are going to be made. There will be administrative changes, the worst of which, from my standpoint, is the effective shutdown of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And I think, by the way, that there is people in the financial community who may be cheering for that, may be making a mistake because it's going to build up a lot of anger the kind of anger which frankly made it harder for us to legislate in some ways. I mean, that's one of the things that you had. The Volcker rule is in part a response to the beat up the banks. The Volcker rule is not on the bill that passed the House. We gave the regulators the power, institution by institution, to do things like the Volcker rule, to insist on some divestments. But you had this kind of anger. That's also, by the way, and when you talk about the penalty for Bear Stearns, there was this public demand and public anger that more people weren't beaten up. Unfortunately, that pressure, I think, is what was reflected by the administration when they did go after. I mean, the Justice Department in particular was getting criticized for not prosecuting anybody. And whatever the merits of that were, I have to say some of my liberal friends seem to have forgotten about due process and the rule that you don't criminally prosecute someone unless it was very clear that the behavior was criminal, and that you don't bring prosecutions unlikely to succeed just to have some emotional satisfaction. But I think that was the Justice Department's, in part, trying to deal with the fact that they were being criticized for not doing enough in the criminal area. And as I said, I think it was a mistake. But to go back overall, I take the fact that there is no significant demand for any legislative change as an indication things have worked out reasonably well. That is, I think we have more stability and no noticeable drag on economic growth. What we were trying to do, and I think this should be clear, we regarded what we were doing in 2010, 9 and 10, as basically pro-market. I think that what happens is regulation lags behind innovation. Inevitably, the private sector is much more dynamic. And I think the problem in 2000 that culminated in 2008 was that regulation had lagged too far behind innovation, and the framework that had came out of the New Deal just had been outmoded by a lot of money coming into the system from non-regulated entities, and most importantly, by information technology. None of it could have happened if you had to do it all without information technology. But our view was that the financial community, with the innovations and with the competitive pressures, had largely, had substantially diminished the responsibility for taking risks that went bad. That you could make loans that weren't going to be repaid without having to worry about it because they were securitized. And you could make these derivative bets without having any backup. I mean, the key revelation for us was when AIG went in and told Ben Bernanke that they needed $85 billion because they couldn't pay off on their credit default swaps. And a week later, he was telling us how much money they needed for the TARP. And he and Paul Sennett said, I want $85 billion for AIG. And we said, oh, no, you told us that last week. And he said, oh, no, that's another $85 billion. AIG was, in fact, $170 billion in debt and didn't know it, had no idea the magnitude. But I do think that we have, I think, achieved a reasonable balance. And the law does allow, it's obviously allows the regulators to moderate. And some of that is going on, and I think that's fine. Even in the Consumer Bureau, while it will be rendered virtually just non-functional for a while, depending on what the judge says, there'll be no legislative changes. The powers will remain. They'll just be there to be resumed. So I think that what we've done is held up reasonably well. In fact, I think very well. I take it continues to be very popular. That's why there's a big difference in the approach of the Trump administration to the health care bill and the financial reform bill, are two major pieces. An all-out effort to repeal, in effect, the health care bill. But really, from the Trump administration, almost no proposals to change legislatively the financial reform bill. And in yesterday's Wall Street Journal, I noticed a lament from Peter Wallison complaining that the Trump administration was being more aggressive in enforcement, particularly, I think, going after money market funds. So that's the, as I said, there is no rollback. There will be a less aggressive enforcement, and I think, and I'm not terribly troubled with that, because I think what it means is that the current regulators will be more sanguine about what the institutions will be doing. They are less inclined to think that the institutions need close supervision. But the powers for them to act well in advance of any real problem developing will remain undiminished. So I don't have any kind of systemic fears about that. The last point, and I want to go back to my first point, that part of the problem here was that we were operating in a situation in much of the financial community was resistant to any regulation at all. I became the chairman designate after the elections of 2006. And in December of 2006, what I was told, and I guess we heard reference to the regulate by principle and not by rule, which I have never been able to translate into anything meaningful. And I remember at the time they were saying you should be like England, and the chief regulator at the time in England said, oh yes, we have a 900-page rule book. But what you got were two reports that came out in 2006 complaining that the financial industry was substantially overregulated. One came from Hal Scott, from the Committee on Corporate Whatever at Harvard Law School, complaining that we were overregulating them and predicting that unless, in this case, we substantially lessened Sarbanes-Oxley, there would almost never be an IPO again in America. And then a report that came out of McKinsey, actually that was charted by Mayor Bloomberg, which also said we were overregulating to the point where we would be at a financial disadvantage. So that's the atmosphere in which we start. And as I said, and then you also have this great public anger. Given all that, I believe we successfully did what we were trying to do, which was to say that increase the extent to which financial institutions taking risks had to bear some responsibility if the risks went bad, and had the financial capacity to deal with that if they went bad. That's essentially what we try to do, and I think that framework has held up.
All right, thank you very much. This is New York City, so not surprisingly, we've had a number of people join us since the conference first started. So I'd like to just take a moment as we load up the slides quickly for our next speaker, for people to create some space for those in the back. And if those in the back want to come join, we still have a lot of open seats. So if we could just take one moment while they load them up.
I am incredibly annoying, and I want to continue. Some of that. No, to be fair, I think everything Steve Cutler said is very reasonable. I disagree with some of his reasonable observation, and I agree with some. And the congressman, of course, is a hero to me. And I agree that the legislative proposals that are now going through the Senate, which are a bipartisan bill, will only affect the regional banks and the community banks and something called custody banks. It won't affect the major banks. But that does show one of the points I'm going to make. What have we learned over the last 10 years? Systemic risk reform has very few long-term allies and many, many enemies. In fact, I would say the safest generalization about how we move with financial reform are these. Financial reform regulation is passed only in the aftermath of a major scandal. I can talk about the South Sea bubble. I don't want to give you the history lesson there, but the British Parliament responded by barring any companies from privately incorporating to get an act of Parliament, which was overly prophylactic. I think Steve could make a valid criticism that barring all corporations from incorporating may have been too much. Although at the time, it seemed like a nice punitive response. And of course, we know the '29 crash. We know Enron and WorldCom precipitated SOX, and the 2008 Great Recession gives us Dodd-Frank, and you could say the same thing going around the world. But after each crash, the financial industry begins to dismantle the legislation, pointing out that there are areas where it probably did overly regulate, all right? But the problem here is there's often a very easy coalition. Liberals on the left want to restore easy credit for the poor and minority groups in the mortgage market. Conservatives on the right want to downsize all regulation, and what you get is very significant rollback that leaves lots of stuff that was working dismantled. And I'll go through an annoying survey of where I think systemic risk reform has not gone quite far enough. That's if I can get. Okay. What's happened that may make us a little bit more risky than we think we are right now? First of all, the Federal Reserve is no longer the lender of last resort, as it is in most other countries where the central bank is the lender of last resort. And that means that in a new crisis, it's not going to be clear how the Federal Reserve can structure a quick bailout. They may find evasions of the provisions in Dodd-Frank, which said no more lending to specific banks, but we don't know. It's uncertain. Next, what's happened? Non-bank SIFIs have largely escaped the reach of regulators. Insurance companies, AIG, all of those people are likely to escape. Regional banks will escape most of Dodd-Frank once the Senate bipartisan bill passes. Stress testing has been eased for all banks below the largest banks. I'm not saying this is wrong. I'm just saying that we're seeing significant movements in the direction of deregulation. The Volcker rule is going to be amended in a number of ways, but it will be, all of the regional banks and community banks will be exempted from the Volcker rule. I'm not really sure why
Not the
small
regional banks, only the community banks, not the regional banks. The Volcker is only for the under 10.
Well, we're going to see much of the bill eliminate the Volcker rule by legislation. The
the
rest
under
of it's going to
10,
come from the White House and the regulatory
But that's
agencies.
different than, yeah.
Well, I don't
Not
care
the
whether
bill.
it's administrative or legislative, we're going to see some
big
downsizing
difference.
of the Volcker rule. Well, when you say that the smaller banks can engage in proprietary trading, I'm not sure that's the classes we want smaller banks to do. In any event, that's the Volcker rule side of this. Attempts to implement Section 956 of Dodd-Frank, which restricts incentive compensation, and it's got strong prophylactic language, have been totally abandoned. I'm going to focus on that because basically I think the two biggest missing sides of the barn. We have a very strong barn with regard to the large banks. There is increased capital, there is increased stress testing, all good, but financial crises always come from the blind side, and the blind side now involves things like the money market funds and the moral hazard problems that are inherent in not having any regulation dealing with incentive compensation. Okay? We have resolution authority, which was the trade-off. The idea was we no longer have the central bank be the lender of last resort, but we'll intervene earlier through resolution authority. I have great doubts that in a political world, the President and the Secretary of Treasury will ever intervene early to put a large bank into receivership if there is the slightest chance that it might survive if everything turned and became more rosy. As a result, the incentives for any president of either administration would be to kick the can down the road and let the crisis go worse and only put a company into receivership on the very doorsteps of bankruptcy. And that wasn't the original idea. The original idea is that it would be earlier intervention, okay? Next, I thought one of the better things done by the Dodd-Frank Act was to greatly strengthen the FSOC, give us a real thinking research capability in the federal branch. The FSOC has been abandoned, and its research side has been largely laid off. So we no longer have the brain capacity in the Federal Reserve to spot crises in advance. Okay, that's just a quick overview. Now let me turn for scenarios for a panic. Scenarios for a panic. It's always a panic that is the real problem. There's a cultural and a cognitive side to all this. There's good news and there's bad news, but where is the risk of financial collapse greatest? Well, the good news, I think large banks are much better capitalized and stress testing does work and has desirable consequences. I think the unregulated shadow banks of 2008 have all moved over and become bank holding companies. The shadow banks that are left are really boutique investment banks that don't have a great deal of consequence. OTC derivatives, which is of course the AIG problem, have been substantially changed and now significantly trade through clearinghouses. That's significantly, that is, they trade through clearinghouses most of the time, but there are a lot of exceptions for end users and the like. Okay. Now the bad news. The largest bailout commitment in 2008 was the government's guarantee of money market funds. That could happen again. As you'll recall, the reserve fund broke the buck, there was a crisis, and the government simply guaranteed to all of America's retail investors that their money market funds would be safe and guaranteed by the government. That's an extraordinary bailout, and I think the industry, the money market industry, wants the same relationship for the future because there has not been significant reform. The FSOC did propose increased capital requirements and they were rebuffed. The industry faced them down, and the SEC was fairly equivocal on this. The SEC put in place some, what I'll call tinkering reforms, rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic by giving us more floating valuations, but it's an uncertain question whether those floating valuations will increase or reduce the risk of crisis and panic if there is stress on the money market funds. Now, more generally, asset-backed securitizations are popular again. Synthetic collateralized debt obligations have returned in volume, and low documentation and interest-only mortgages are once again being included in securitization portfolios. Now, that's eerie to me, that we're once again seeing low credit, interest-only mortgage loans go into securitization portfolios. Everybody has forgotten a lot there quickly. Lending by U.S. money market funds, which is the body that I think is most likely to be the subject of a future crisis, lending by U.S. money market funds in the repo market, you remember problems in the repo market from 2008, rose significantly from 0.6 trillion through all of 2016 to over 1 trillion now in 2017. That's a 60% increase in just 1 year. And on Monday, Bitcoin futures start trading on the CME, and it won't be much long after that before the CBOE starts trading options on Bitcoin. What does this mean to me? I'm not saying a crisis is imminent. I'm saying that the appetite for risk-taking has returned, and there are sides to the financial barn that have no protection, the side dealing with money market funds. And then I want to come to the other little topic I want to focus on, which is moral hazard and executive compensation. Okay, given the strong perception that incentive compensation produced short-termism and moral hazard, Dodd-Frank quite properly took two divergent and maybe somewhat contradictory steps, but one of them I really approve of. First, it federalized some aspects of corporate governance in order to give shareholders greater power. I have some doubts about that. But then secondly, in Section 956, it authorized regulators to prohibit executive incentive-based compensation, that is excessive incentive-based compensation, at covered financial institutions where, quote, it could lead to a material financial loss. Okay? Now, what's happened here? There was much evidence then and now, I'm referring here largely to the work of Renee Stoltz, that the more closely the alignment between the interests of shareholders and bank senior executives, the worse the bank fared during the 2008 crisis. That is, banks with shareholder-friendly corporate governance fared much worse than banks that had only old-fashioned, unfriendly corporate governance. Why? The interests of shareholders and the interests of systemic risk reform are very much in opposition. Indeed, the worst thing that could happen in the future, in my view, would be that hedge funds decided to become much more active in investing in large, major, too-big-to-fail banks. Bottom line, I don't think empowering shareholders was a great idea. The Dodd-Frank Act did this, but rightly or wrongly, the D.C. Circuit struck it down. The proxy access rules were sued by the Business Roundtable and Chamber of Commerce sued, and they won in a very dubious decision. But while the decision is dubious, I think proxy access for large financial institutions was a dangerous idea. Anyway, for better or worse, it's disappeared. The SEC has not sought to propose any replacement or reform rule. More important, however, was what the Act did in terms of its paternalistic prong. Let me see if I can move us on to. Ah, we got it. Okay. And which one is that? That's
Yeah, one more.
okay. 956, which I think was exactly the right step that had to be taken, said that federal regulators had to jointly prescribe regulations requiring covered financial institutions to disclose the structure of all incentive-based compensation arrangements covering executives and to bar those kinds of incentive-based compensation that could lead to excessive risk-taking. I won't give you the exact statutory language. What was going to be done? Well, the first thing you could do is look at what the total structure of incentive compensation was. And here, I want to go back to a document that was much disclosed in 2008, hasn't been seen since. This is then Attorney General Andrew Cuomo listing the incentive structure, the incentive compensation paid at the largest banks in 2008. And if we're up here, what we're seeing here is the really large, too big to fail banks. And by the way, J.P. Morgan is the hero of this group that has very little problems compared to the others. But let's take a look at Citigroup. They managed to lose $27.7 billion, and for that success, they had a bonus pool of $5.33 billion. I've occasionally observed, somewhat cynically, that if you want to lose $27 billion much more cheaply, I can do it for under $100 billion. Just put me in charge, and I won't charge anything like that price for losing $27 billion. But we see at Citigroup, and we see the same thing at Merrill Lynch, $27 billion and a $3.6 billion bonus pool. Even at firms that did relatively well, like J.P. Morgan, the bonus pool exceeded the total profits for that year. That's the size of the bonus pool. My point is only the bonus culture has very deep roots on Wall Street. This is the area where I think reform was needed. The most famous line of the era was the CEO of Citigroup, Chuck Prince, saying that, well, he knew there were problems with these securitizations, but, quote, you can't stop dancing until the music stops. What does that mean? It means probably that because of the high incentive compensation being paid, most of the executives wanted their securitization deals to close no matter what. We got to get it done by year end, even if it's adding to our total liability and a bigger explosion down the road. And there was a bigger explosion down the road, but they got their incentive compensation. So 956 said you should do a number of things. Okay, you got it? Yeah. Okay. What happened in 956? Let me give you a very short history because time is running out. Very elaborate rules were proposed in 2011, the year after Dodd-Frank was adopted. And this was a topic they went to right away because it's a very important topic that involves real causation. Those rules sat for 5 years, and in 2016, a much murkier set of rules came out that no longer required the same level of deferrals that applied only to senior executives, totally exempted traders. Now, my view is that traders were the real danger at banks, not the senior executives. The general counsel, important as he is probably not the person who's going to cause a systemic risk crisis. The trader might be, but they were exempted. Anyway, all those rules and the strange trade-offs in 2016 are totally irrelevant. It came out in August 2017 that all of the financial regulators have now moved the topic of incentive compensation reform from the short-term to the long-term study. That is, no one is now working in any of the financial regulators on doing anything with incentive compensation, even though the Act instructed all the financial regulators to impose such controls on incentive compensation. Instead, it's been moved everywhere to the long-term study and out of the short-term reform. We've seen nothing in this area. So I've left you with these two comments. I'm going to go down to my final page so I can finish in time. Which is that? Is that the Well, I'm going to skip clawbacks, so just go to the thing. I think boards may today be, am I on the final slide? Okay, boards today probably are more cautious about incentive compensation. Certainly they understand the need for greater capital. I don't think the real problems are with our major banks at the moment. But I think we have a new attitude towards accepting increased risk-taking and risk-taking by institutions that have no protection, such as the money market funds. I also noticed that incentive compensation the attitude has changed. On last Friday, the lead headline in the Financial Times was, UBS chief says drive to curb bankers' pay fueled by envy. And now we're back to that wonderful world of food fight. You're doing this to me because you have deep envy. I still think that if you have unrestricted incentive compensation, you're going to have some very short-term moral hazard decisions made. Okay. We're now in a constantly rising stock market with tax relaxation, at least tax relaxation for the rich, about to appear, and concern about systemic risk is seeming to become dated. People are no longer talking about it. Crises always come from the blind side. but the vulnerability of money market funds and the possibility that incentive compensation will give us extreme risk-taking is still very much there. This is not the fault of Dodd-Frank. You put the stuff in the legislation, and no one has followed up on that. The FSOC started out trying to do something about money market funds, but they were clearly rebuffed by the powers that be. And I think thus we have a financial barn with a couple of sides that have nothing more than paper and no substance. Therefore, I'm going to tell you, again, I told you I can be incredibly annoying, that the problem of systemic risk is still very much with us. It will come from a different blind side, but there's always that pattern that it comes from the blind side, and we have several blind sides where the vulnerability of these institutions is clear, and sooner or later they're likely to be tested. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Congressman Frank wants to follow up.
Obviously, I agree with much of what Professor Coffey says in specific, because he was defending the bill, but I have to say that I think that, as is often the case outside of the strict mathematical field, the whole there was smaller than the sum of the parts. I agreed with many of the parts. I think you exaggerate the systemic risk in a couple of ways. First of all, this one I know well, because I'm confident in my political expertise. I think you misread badly the political pressures that would come on a president if a large institution was in trouble. Even in the current atmosphere, the insistence would be that they shoot people, not that they bail them out. The notion that
Afterwards.
no, the notion that there would be great pressure. First of all, because there's some inconsistencies, because one of the things I gather you lamented was that we restricted the ability of the Federal Reserve simply on its own hook to put that money in there, which of course they do without the president. I mean, that would be irrelevant to a president. What they did get instead was the ability to lend, as long as it is to more than one institution, if they can say that it's illiquid and not insolvent. The notion that, and here I got to say, you talk about who does this. The American people simply are not going to tolerate, and I know this is something Tim Geithner has argued for, Scott, no. The American people will not tolerate a restoration to the Federal Reserve of an unblinkered discretion to put money into any institution it wants to, whenever it wants to, which is what Section 13.3 said. And the reason for that, by the way, was a very specific time. It's when it came out that AIG, which was the main culprit, had paid bonuses to the people who had incurred $170 billion beyond what they could pay off. But I think we did, but on the other side, in terms of intervening, the political pressure would still be against helping one of the big banks. And the notion that a president would be constrained, or the Secretary of the Treasury, from intervening if a big institution got in trouble, I think just gets it wrong. Secondly, with regard to mortgages, yeah, some interest only are coming, and I agreed with your point that I was dismayed when some of my liberal friends joined with some of the banks to basically get rid of the risk retention rule for most mortgages. But the worst mortgages and the mortgages that were the most the cause are still illegal. Nobody can make them, except some of the smallest banks, and they can only make them, in that case, if they keep them in portfolio. So the ability to make those kinds of loans that cause the most problem and securitize them is just not there anymore for any institution.
Well, we have an empirical question here, and we'll see in the future. You can have a difference in perspective on whether presidents will put a bank that's in trouble but not yet known to be clearly failing into receivership. I see the opposition party in such a case immediately saying the president caused the failure. It happened on his watch. I think every president doesn't want a major bank to fail on his watch.
No, even more now, given the recent political history, and this is why you don't see even the Republicans in Congress seriously trying to undercut any of that ability. Even more now, a president is still afraid of being too favorable to that kind of institution. The bailout is still a bad word. One of the frustrations I have is that we Democrats get blamed for the bailouts when all 5 of the bailouts were started by George W. Bush. But that one I think you misread politically. But on the more specifics, no, the worst mortgages are still illegal and can't be made. Similarly, with regard to the banks under 10, I am not worried about this.
I wasn't challenging that. I understand that's a reasonable thing to do.
No, I understand that, but what you said was,
Okay.
you can still have the securitization of the interest-only mortgages. And I agree with that, But what I'm saying is the worst kind of mortgages are not going to be in securitizations because they can't be made.
All right, this is a lively debate that I want us to continue. This being an academic conference, my role was shifted from moderator to discussant. So part of what I want to spend just a minute doing is trying to focus on a theme that I think actually cuts across all three of these conversations, these presentations, and then have that motivate some of our discussion over the challenges that we're facing and where we're likely to go. And one of the things that I noticed was a common theme in all three were these concerns about complexity. So I just want to, in a few pictures, look at where we are today. So really quickly, this is work by some economists using techniques that are used in computer science to evaluate the US code. And what they're trying to figure out is how well structured is this code to achieve what it's meant to achieve versus lead to breakdowns. And what they found is Title 12, which is the title that deals with banks and financial institutions, is second only to the Internal Revenue Code in terms of its complexity. Moreover, this looks nothing like what it's supposed to look like. We have nice few red dots in the middle and blue dots all along the periphery. So we have this incredibly complex and therefore prone to breakdown structure of the US legal code. That code, as we all know, is then put into place by a bunch of regulators. This is a nice chart put out by JP Morgan. Admittedly, at a point in time, where as pointed out earlier, they were trying to push back very strongly against
No, this was
Dodd-Frank.
after it had happened.
No, this was after it happened.
This is a reflection.
And this-
So this probably cost us a few $1 billion because regulators got so mad at us for publishing this. But,
I doubt that very sincerely.
And they were constrained by reality.
I'm sorry, but I want what regulators are you accusing of acting out of pique, and what punishment did they find? I think that's irresponsible.
no regulator would ever do that.
No, excuse me. I don't want to drop that. I think that's an outrageous charge, and it's particularly from one of the banks that made some of the mistakes. Tell me what regulator you think penalized you, and to what extent
here's what I would
because they
say.
got politically mad at you.
Regulators are human beings too.
I answer my question. You
So-
never answer questions. I feel like I'm back in the house and you guys are testifying. I just, let me again go on record saying that's an outrageous, irresponsible thing to say, and the fact that you can't back it up does not
No,
support it.
I don't think it is, but.
Back it up then.
Well, I can't actually tell you where it happened. I suspect it happened.
Oh, you suspect it?
Yes.
Okay.
That's why I
And the
said
congressman
probably.
admitted earlier
Do you
that this is
suspect
one of
it
the
happens
ongoing
At
challenges.
night, do you suspect it happens or during the day?
Oh, actually,
fight, it's more
all
fun.
24 hours a day. But this was post.
After adopted, yeah.
Right. This is post adoption of, I think, a regulatory scheme, which is actually very fair. We just said, okay, let's. I mean, one of the things, and you talked about it, Congressman. One of the areas where I think we could have done better is simplifying the regulatory scheme.
No question.
And, there is a multiplicity of regulators all looking at the same areas. That's not great regulation, right? Things
No,
can
but
be.
I agree, but here's the problem. You get vested interests in existing institutions. Consolidating, i.e. abolishing, we did abolish one institution. We abolished the Office of Thrift Supervision, which was a duplicate of the Office of Control of the Currency. I was determined to get rid of that because when institutions want to do dishonest things or irresponsible things, they got a thrift charter. And I was determined either to abolish that or change its name at the very least to the Office of Fig Leaf Dispensation. But we were able to abolish it. The other problem was all those other institutions had vested interest. Here was the problem. Given the political fight we had to get the substantive regulations done, we wouldn't have had the votes to do both. I do think going forward, now, and I'll finish with this, but I do think the fact is we've now had President Trump and a Republican Congress, and essentially there is no legislative effort to change things, and that's relevant only in the sense that it does mean it survives for a future administration. Given that there now appears to be a consensus on the major outlines of the substantive regulations, now I do think you could ask people to put the political effort into simplifying, and there would be a unity with the financial institutions. So I agree, SEC, CFTC, rationalizing banks among OCC and the Fed and the FDIC, that ought to be the next agenda item with, I think, more consensus. The precondition for that was agreement on the substantive regulation, which I think essentially we have.
And since we had Steve Cutler jumping in, understandably, on the complexity of the regulatory regime, I decided to jump ahead to my slides to the complexity of financial institutions. So this is a work being done by Kamrasi and Dick Herring, and what they're looking at is both the size, but also the complexity. And the proxy they're using for complexity is the number of subsidiaries. And what we see is a dramatic increase over time. We also see it in the breakdown of the different types of subsidiaries they have. And again, regulators will say post-crisis, things like stress tests have been used to try to bring about simplification. What we are still seeing on the whole, though, is large financial institutions with well over 1,000 different subsidiaries working across different areas, which of course maps on to the challenges mapped out earlier regarding the different regulatory bodies that they're subject to. And then going back to alongside the banking system, as was already discussed, we have, of course, the rise of the shadow banking system, which I think is alive and well. You look at mortgages today, and actually a great majority of the mortgages are shifting outside of the banking sector into the non-regulated sector, and that's where they're being originated. So this was an effort by the New York Fed to map what is called sometimes shadow banking, sometimes market-based intermediation. And the idea is simple. We have liquidity transformation, we have maturity transformation happening outside the banking sector through disaggregated entities in ways that we didn't even realize were a source of fragility prior to the crisis. We've tried to address it. This is the complexity of the system on the whole, where again, you have money market mutual funds through a whole variety of different entities, eventually providing the capital for things like home loans. And of course, this is within those securitization structures. We have heterogeneity of different assets that are bundled together in ways of creating massive informational challenges. So again, for all three of you, this raises some incredibly interesting issues. So I want to turn it over to Congressman Frank.
Yeah, let me just say with regard to the mortgages, first, any mortgage is regulated. It's not, you can't issue these prohibited mortgages outside a bank. The problem is, what's this new form they're calling where they have a mortgage? It's not called a mortgage. And I'm getting old and I forget the specific, but there are institutions now that sort of provide money to people to buy homes. The CFPB, the Consumer Bureau, was looking into that. That is one of the lessons. That was, they were able, it wasn't technically a mortgage, so it evaded the restrictions on these kinds of mortgages where you had, which applied to everybody, bank or non-bank. The CFPB was beginning to go after those from the consumer protection standpoint, and that, you're right, that now will be shut down by Mulvaney, and so you will have that problem with those kind of alternatives.
And you wanted to jump in?
Well, I wanted to extend the Congressman's point. He picked on the SEC and the CFTC, and that's usually the example, but it's only one example. We have something like 17 different financial regulators. We have a special regulator for credit unions. We have a special regulator for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And when you have that many, small regulators are probably more easily captured than very large regulators.
The bank. There is another problem with the LCC, FDIC, and the Fed. I mentioned that one as well.
Well, but we have 17 different regulators for different characters of financial institutions. And I think the problem with that is that you can have the industry better capture a very small, invisible regulator. Now, look around the globe, what do you see? Countries deviate between a single peak or a dual peak structure of financial regulation. The U.S. has a Himalaya of small peaks, not a Himalaya, a Catskill of small peaks, little bumps. And I think you need broader consolidation so that you can have better political accountability. So I'm agreeing with your point, but I want to go beyond
Right,
the
I would
SEC.
say this, and I would say this to Steve as well, I'm serious, this is my frustration. We tried to do some consolidation. We ran into this problem with the dual banking system. That's why we have more bank regulators than most countries, because we have, and the state chartered banks had a lot of power and were able to resist. But now, I wouldn't have said this, but it does seem to me now at the end of this year, if the Senate passes the bill that it's going to pass, I believe, it will, and by the way, the other thing I would say about derivatives is, even though there won't be a vocal rule, all derivatives are still subject to those restrictions that you mentioned, which make it better. Although the end user piece, they can connive to getting out from under. But I think there is enough of a consensus now. There's not going to be any effort at a major weakening of the basic legislative structure. I would hope at this point, and people in the industry and those of us who wanted regulation in general should be able to come together on a scheme for administrative consolidation. because there's now a common interest. Instead of fighting about whether we have the substance or not, I think there is a common interest among a lot of entities now who are interested in efficient and effective regulation in rationalizing the structure. And I'm going to propose that be kind of a joint effort that people undertake.
I'm less sanguine, I think, than you are, Congressman, that the political will is there. You're the expert on political will to do things like consolidate agencies. I mean, we're doing it around the margins a little bit, so you can see.
All right, let me repeat.
Yeah.
The problem before was, until this year, seriously, it's only now, at the end of this year, that it's clear that with the Senate bill. I mean, the Senate bill means two, and it's very important, means two things. First, that the under 10s get some relief and the regionals don't go into the FSOC, although they're still subject to a lot of the other regulations. And what you now have, but what that bill means is that there's no change to anything else. There was an acceptance of anything else. So I think now there is a willingness on the part of, no, obviously there'll still be the political resistance, but this is a new situation where there is essentially a consensus on the outlines, the major outlines of the legislation. Even on 956, obviously that broke my heart, but it's there for the future, although the Obama administration, as you pointed out, lagged on that one. There were no great changes. By the way, the corporate governance thing, I'll give you politically, that came from CalPERS and CalSTRS. The California, the reason for the corporate governance, the proxy access, that was the insistence on the two major California retirement funds transmitted through a person of great legislative influence and Californianess.
And by the way, that proxy access has
I can
happened.
get who that is. We got that.
Proxy access has actually happened with
Different kind. A much more hedge fund activism has happened.
Well, no. Proxy access has happened. Sort of, if you look at the vast majority. One second.
No, I'm about to
Okay. Of public companies have adopted a form of proxy access because, frankly, the market has demanded it.
And even on
So you've seen
compensation.
a wave of that without the SEC actually having to do it. The SEC rule did get scuttled, but essentially the market has replaced that. That may or may not be a good thing. But I think, on balance, I'm a little bit more optimistic about.
Well, I'm not
proxy
surprised
access.
about that, but all right.
Well, Steve, I would say this. Yes, the market is doing it, but if the SEC, if we hadn't told the SEC to start it, I don't think the market would have.
I think
The
you
other
may be
point I would
right.
make, and this is, and I get this from being on the bank board, an influence, whether good or bad, but an influence constraining, at least to some extent, compensation. Now the powerful influences from the proxy advisory services. They are a major input that boards have to take into account.
Well, Say on Pay has done something. I agree.
Say on Pay has done something,
And the
and
advisory
I would
service.
also say, and you mentioned this, Professor Coffey, when it comes to the big financial institutions, you've got a combination of disclosure and you've got regulatory oversight, notwithstanding the absence of an express rule. And so if you look at what big financial institutions have done in terms of compensation of senior management, it's got very serious clawbacks. It's got very serious deferrals. It's got a lot of compensation that is subject to a board saying, you know what, we had a year or we had several years in which we didn't perform and you're not going to get paid. And you've seen that. Just look at what's happened to compensation at Deutsche Bank. Just look at what's happened to compensation at Credit Suisse. And you can argue that notwithstanding the absence of some of the regulatory mechanisms that you were talking about, it's happened.
Well, again, just so we understand what I am saying, we have a financial barn that has strong walls on three sides, and we have no wall at all with respect to money market funds. We may have some practice. We may have some practice that's better with regard to incentive compensation at the largest banks with boards that are probably the most professional. But we have, it's not law, that's practice, and practice can change as the climate for risk-taking becomes more aggressive.
John, I would say this because I'm on the board of a mid-sized bank, and I've learned two things. People ask me what I've learned on the board. By the way, one of the things I've learned on the board is that very little of it is my fault. The major pain in the ass for the medium banks and some of the others has got nothing to do with the bill I co-sponsored. It has to do with money laundering and bank secrecy and the Patriot Act. The Know Your Customer rule that people complain about was not in our legislation. There's a lot of problems going elsewhere. But the other one is the proxy advisory services have a major impact on compensation.
All right, I want to open it up. Before we do so, really quickly, so go ahead and line up for questions. We'll go ahead and use it from this mic. Follow up on this question of complexity, because I think it does cut through what each of you are talking about. So, I mean, Article 1 clearly authorizes Congress to engage in lawmaking, but looking at the complexity of the legal scheme that we have, you did a great job. But how did you confront the informational challenges that you were facing? And in particular, the anti-bailout rhetoric was so powerful, and they couldn't understand the liquidity mismatch and the reasons we want to have this. Steve Cutler, you mentioned earlier the London whale, and you were talking about the frustration of having to deal with 5 or 6 different regulators. That might be an understandable frustration, but again, how does having, I think at this point, 1,300 subsidiaries in terms of the corporate structure potentially increase the possibility of those types of things arising, even if not challenges to the system, they're going to be losses that are going to be harder to detect. And then Professor Coffey, you did a great job already summarizing some of the challenges this creates for regulators. But could you talk a little bit more about whether the SEC is going to stand strong when they are working against banks where they really can't understand the internal workings and how the incentives are going to break down inside those institutions?
Start with.
Well, I'll start by saying I think, first of all, we brought the number of subsidiaries way down, and I think one of the helpful things about the recovery and resolution process is I think it's forced banks to look inward at how they're structured. Having said that, there are probably 50 subsidiaries that actually matter at JP Morgan. And so, a lot of them are set up for one transaction vehicles. And I would also say none of the structural number of subsidiaries, maybe it's a proxy for something, but none of it's the cause of the crisis. And so we ought to be careful about sort of pointing to something and saying, aha, that suggests that these firms were way too complex and that caused the crisis. It really didn't. There is not a nexus between number of subsidiaries and problems that we had in 2007, 2008.
I'll move over to the Congressman, but I do want to add to that. One of the key challenges was not the overall losses. We've talked a lot about risk-taking here, but the fact that nobody knew how those losses were allocated. If we look at the actual value of wealth that was wiped out, it was by no means all of that significant given the size of the financial system, but there was incredible difficulty within institutions and within the market as a whole by regulators to understand how those losses were allocated. And I think a lot of work has been done to suggest that the degree of market dysfunction, which far outweighed the losses, is at least in part a byproduct of the fact that people just didn't know whether their counterparties were healthy.
Well, yeah, even worse. I mean, again, AIG, talk about the opacity. They literally had no idea how much money they owed. I mean, they told Ben Bernanke in September 1 week that they owed $85 billion, and a week later they said, whoops, it's $170 billion. I mean, this isn't a marginal error. This is like no idea. As to the question,
what does it mean for Congress right now? As we are in this incredibly complex world, dealing with these complex structures, how does that shape the challenge that you're facing?
All right, well, first of all, remember there's no such thing as Congress in this issue. There's a Democratic Congress and a Republican Congress. I wish that weren't the case.
Yeah.
When I will go back to saying that I think we have a basis for going towards the administrative stuff is that the Republicans in Congress who wanted to substantially diminish the legislative structure have now acknowledged that they, A, don't have the votes for that, and they don't have the votes for that in part because it is popular. People running for re-election don't want to re-deregulate derivatives. But where you are in Congress now is at a kind of a stalemate because you have a president and a House that wants to cut way back. Here the filibuster is over. You can't do this by reconciliation. And there are literally, of the 48 Democrats, there are none who are ready to reduce the regulation. And you have Senator Collins who voted for it and a few others who don't want to deal with it. So I think Congress, that's why I would hope people might take up the other. But I would get to your other question about how do we deal with this. We paid a lot of attention to executive, but people forget, well, whatever happened to bipartisanship? Well, I will tell you what happened to bipartisanship is Obama got elected and Mitch McConnell went on strike, and I will document that. Read the books by Hank Paulson, Ben Bernanke, and Sheila Bair, the 3 top financial regulators appointed by George W. Bush. And they are all about how much cooperation they got from us on the Democratic side much more than they got from their Republican colleagues. And beginning in 2007 and 8, we worked closely with Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson. And I will give George W. Bush credit on this, by the way. Knowing that the great bulk of his party hated a lot of this, he gave Paulson and Bernanke full backup, and I think that was good. But we spent a lot of effort with them, and then we, of course, had it with the Obama people as well. We also had consumer groups and others who were relevant, academics, and then some from the financial industry. As it became clearer that we were going to go ahead, then we were able to work with people in the financial industry about how to do it. I had particular relations with the Bank of America people because their political people were based in Boston. So we did, once people were willing to accept this is what we're going to do, we listened to some of that. But the single biggest source of information was the two administrations, Bush and Obama.
Well, I think the congressman has raised an interesting idea, that now that it's clear that Dodd-Frank will not be dismantled and just minor edge changes, we should be thinking about reorganization of financial regulation for systemic risk purposes. Now, what should be done in that light? I think we should recognize first, and I have told you I'm very annoying, that some agencies are better at some things than others. The SEC is a good disclosure agency, a good consumer protection agency, not nearly so good about systemic risk.
Right.
One of the unknowable questions is whether if the Federal Reserve was supervising Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers, they might have intervened a little bit earlier in the SEC, which I don't think was aware of what was going
They
on.
wouldn't have been given the right to set their own capital standards,
Well, that's another, okay.
which the
Okay.
SEC gave them.
Well, you're suggesting that I might be right, that there might have been closer regulation.
Yes,
We
I'm
don't
sorry.
know what would have happened.
Are you annoyed if I say you're not annoying?
It would be so hard to prove that thesis.
No, I was saying that that's a specific example, I think, of where the Fed would have done
Okay.
better.
Well, the SEC may not be perfect at everything it does, but it's very used to its own dogma and its own status quo. Next, if we're going to do anything for the future, the FSOC has been given a lobotomy by the current administration. We need to put some brains back into the FSOC to have someone direct it. And third, we are much too obsessed with saying what caused the 2008 crisis. I fully agree that proprietary trading did not cause the 2008 crisis, but if too big to fail banks are too big to fail, which I think is definitional, you've got to restrict their risk-taking, and things like the Volcker Rule are important. We can't let you engage in every kind of risk-taking where you see a potential for profit. Banks have to be treated a little bit differently, and I think things like the Volcker Rule should be maintained as part of the heart of the current system.
No, the impetus for the Volcker Rule was, it's kind of to deal with people who want to break them up and Glass-Steagall. The Volcker Rule reduced both their size and complexity, and it could have been any of a number of things. And that was why when it was first proposed, it became widely accepted.
All right.
But it's in danger.
I hate to interrupt this amazing debate between Bernie and John, but I will. My name is David Sutcliffe. I want to address this to Bernie and John. In terms of Jamie saying there will be another hit in the market, and John saying the barn door is wide open to the problems to come, I go back to the previous problem where Eric Holder and company decided that bankers were too big to jail, and the anger of the American public that nobody was held accountable for taking down the global financial system. And I think the book that you've probably both read, The Chicken Shit Club, starring Eric Holder, is worthy of...
I was waiting for the movie.
Okay. Was worthy of some note. So let me ask you both, what can we do to prevent the hit that Jamie says is coming?
Well, first, I am sorry that more people weren't prosecuted, but a couple of things. And again, a lot of my liberal friends have forgotten our belief in due process. A central element of due process is that you should not be criminally prosecuted if you could not have known that your behavior was criminal to a reasonable degree. Not that doesn't mean ignorance of the law. If you didn't know the law, that's not the issue. The issue was, if you did know the law, could you have figured that out? And the other thing you're saying, fairness to them, part of the problem, once again, is the American people. Look at what's happened. I don't think there is a worse example of acquittals, if you're looking at the scorecard for the prosecutors, than we've seen in the financial field recently, where they have tried to bring some of these cases. It's kind of hard to get the jurors to think about this as criminal. So I also believe that again is, I think, partly why they were so tough, unfairly tough on J.P. Morgan Chase and Bank of America with regard to liability for institutions that they were pressed to take over on things that had happened before they took them over. As to the future hit, I don't know exactly what Jamie Dimon said it's going to be, so I can't predict. I don't know what specifically he said. Steve, do you know what he was talking about? Or?
Well, look, we're going to have failures. I think what has happened over the last 10 years is I think we have gotten ourselves to a place where if any one big bank fails, it's not going to be systemic. That we've so capitalized the system, we've created so much liquidity that we can actually see a big bank fail without the kind of systemic impact that
Without bringing down everybody with it.
Correct. So let me just actually say one word about prosecutors and where their heads are, because I've been on that side of the table. There is nothing that a prosecutor would want more than to bring a case against an executive of a big financial institution. So it's not for want of trying, believe me, it's not for want of will that those cases didn't get brought. But, you know, as Congressman Frank said, we do live in America. We are a system where, you know, you don't bring cases unless actually someone did something that's provable and wrong.
And part of the problem is, remember, we did pass a law. Some of the things that were outrageous weren't illegal at the time. We have made a few more of them illegal.
If I can get a comment in here, because I sort of specialize in white-collar crime, whether or not Holder really said banks are too big to jail is a debate I don't want to get into, but there seemed to be a passive approach. That changed at the end of the Obama administration with something called the Yates Memorandum, which said if you are going to prosecute a corporation, don't give them a deferred prosecution agreement till you force them to cooperate fully and identify who is responsible. Yes, the prosecutors didn't have the evidence to go against individuals, partly because they didn't pressure the entity enough to give them that evidence. If the entity says, we are either going to get fined a very high excessive fine in our view, or we're going to have to turn over the responsible officers, you will see some change in behavior. So I think that the Yates Memorandum took the right tack. Not that we're going to send CEOs to prison. They're too remote. I'm not arguing for vicarious liability, but you can find intermediate senior executives who knew enough to be criminally liable if the entity is under great pressure to identify them. Is that going to happen? Well, the Yates Memorandum was the end of the Obama administration. Attorney General Sessions has just announced that they are going to greatly increase and have a new policy towards the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is basically about foreign bribery. And they are going to have a policy under which you can always turn yourself in, possibly at the last moment, identify some of the facts that happen, and get a complete pass, complete guaranteed immunity. That's a big shift, and I think we're going to see some problems from that. I'm not saying that you shouldn't sometimes give companies a pass if they turn themselves in, but they should turn in the officers as well before they get this kind of pass. Someone was responsible, and not everyone deserves that kind of immunity. So this is sort of beneath the area that's yet hit the headlines. But there is a new policy towards the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and it is a very deregulatory policy in the criminal law field.
And part of the problem there, again, and, you know, I wish they'd been a little more aggressive, but going, and you're right, but it would have been impossible to get the CEOs. It was just hard to make a criminal case. If you got too far down the chain, then people scoffed and said, oh, you're letting the big guys go off the hook. By the way, I'm sure most people recognize that the Yates in question was the Yates that Donald Trump fired early in the administration.
All right, another question from our audience.
Thank you very much. I have a quick question for Congressman Frank and also a follow-up for Mr. Cutler. My name is David Wilkie, and I'm a graduate of Columbia Business School. I also worked for Senator Lugar on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee during the financial crisis and was brought over to the Ag Committee as far as working on legislation to oversight of the CFTC. I would like to correct a little bit of the record there. And one of the things that has been repealed in the Dodd-Frank language is the Cardin-Lugar Amendment, which was a bipartisan amendment to give sunshine, specifically, Mr. Coffey, what you were talking about was the extractive industries, especially with oil, with forcing companies to disclose in their financials payments that they were making overseas. The Europeans and the Canadians have also gone along with that. That's been repealed by this administration. Specifically, I'm coming back to thinking about the underlying problems with the original crisis, and that was home ownership. Congressman Frank, you've always been a great supporter of home ownership and personal home ownership, no?
No, I think we've overdone it.
Yeah, okay. Well, that was my question is, what do you think the role of the government should play in home ownership, and is there an optimal level if you do think there is?
Two things. First of all, thank you for bringing that up. By the way, the Cardin-Lugar Amendment, I don't know if you know Senator Lugar and Senator Cardin, they may seem unlikely people to you to have channeled Bono. But the amendment in question, it was called Publish What You Pay, and its major champion was Bono, the entertainer. And it was a very important point which said that any American corporation that is paying to extract any resource from a foreign country, it didn't ban anything, but they simply had to make public what they paid, both in bribes or in taxes or anything else, because you have the substantial problem of countries not getting any of the benefit from that. And yes, that was, unfortunately, by the time they got around to promulgating that regulation, they could not have repealed it because they couldn't have gotten 60 votes in the Senate. But they were able to repeal it under this 60-day rule, this provision whereby any regulation that hadn't been in effect for 60 days could be repealed by a simple majority of both houses and signed by the president. And that was one of the great, and you're right, we got the European Union to do it. In fact, I was at a meeting in Davos with the European Union and Bono, and we got it done. As far as home ownership, I think it is a great mistake. My single biggest cause during my time in Congress, well, obviously for obvious reasons, my rights as a gay man took a certain amount of my attention, but it was rental housing. We make it, we should be doing a lot more for rental housing. And I was generally, even with regard to Fannie Mae, my biggest thing that I was pushing there was their multifamily portfolio, which, by the way, was never in trouble. That one was good. No, I think we have made a great mistake on the home ownership issue. In fact, one of the things that I got through that's been a victim of the transition was legislation that would take some of the profit from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and fund a low-income housing fund to build affordable rental housing. As for a number, no, there is no number. But I think just in general, this notion that it devalues lower-income people, it overvalues it. Even the New York Times, you had some series about what a terrible thing it was for these neighborhoods when these renters were moving in. So I think it's a great social problem that we underfinance affordable rental housing and overly subsidize home ownership. That's some part of the Trump tax bill with which I have some sympathy.
One final question.
Carl Trapp, Columbia Business School, 91. Picking up on your question or your comment about sympathy for the Trump tax bill, I was curious if there's any other aspects of it which you would support or
No.
as merits.
No,
And if the ship has left the port, if there's anything that can be done.
The limits, I do think the limits on the home mortgage interest deduction, I mean, if I would make it a new country, you wouldn't have a home mortgage interest deduction, but you can't, you've got vested interest there. But I think limiting it to a great extent makes a lot of sense. And the argument from realtors that you should not raise the standard deduction because that will diminish the value of the home mortgage interest deduction makes me crazy. But beyond that, no. I think it's unlikely to be stopped. First of all, the precondition for stopping it would be the election of Doug Jones in Alabama, because I don't see them getting, the 3 Republicans, 2 maybe, maybe Senator Collins. there is a lot of kickback over the limitation on state and local, but most of the states there have no Republican senator, and so that doesn't affect it. It could have, Senator Collins could have problems with that in Maine. So I think the thing is that the political impulse to get that done is so important for the Republican Party. And you have this other problem, which is, and this is again affects Senator Collins, you're in a legislative body, you're a member of a party, there are limits to the extent to which you can just tell them to go screw. And having killed health care, it's very hard for a senator who wants to continue to be a Republican and operate in that atmosphere to say no on both health care and taxes, just I'm talking the personal stuff. You know, Corker can do it because he's going anyway. And you might have thought Flake might do it, but I think Flake's a faker. So I do not expect him to ever, apparently his major objection to Donald Trump is that he has hurt his feelings, and he will be critical back, but he will never vote in any way other than what Donald Trump wants.
All right, join me in thanking our panelists.
You were terrific.
Well, I appreciate that.